Okay. All right. And is this transformation process of believers, is that in some ways preparing them to be prepared for the heavenlies, or the place where they're in fact taken? In other words, do their bodies need to be transformed to be suitable for presence in where the Lord takes them?
Yeah, I think so, because apparently, Jesus was in his resurrected body able to move in and out of apparently our three-dimensional world at will, and he would appear in a locked room with the disciples and then just as quickly vanish out of their sight, seemingly able to dematerialize and rematerialize whenever he wanted to. Mm-hmm. So these are qualities that are not in our three-dimensional world, obviously, and they are definitely supernatural, glorified body type of traits. And by the way, Philippians chapter 3, verse 21 says that our mortal bodies will be transformed into the likeness of his glorious body. So apparently, believers will also share these same kind of traits that Jesus had in his glorified body, which is something very exciting to think about.
So for lack of a better term, if there are extra dimensions in what we know of as heaven, or just different dimensions, our bodies have to be transformed to be suitably prepared to be able to function within that space.
Absolutely. We're heading toward an eternal reward, and in order to take part in that, we would have to have a body that is eternal, that is not corruptible.
Okay.
So,
well, I want to test. I want to test your model a little bit, David, because I know this is probably blowing the minds of a lot of people who are listening.
At least I hope it is.
Me, yeah. At least I hope it is, because we're really just scratching the surface of the
tremendous. We haven't got there yet.
the tremendous contributions that I think you've made in this field, of which this book we're discussing tonight was only your initial foray in that area, and created a huge earthquake in its own right. When it was released and people are getting a hold of it, and I've heard some of the incredible words and feedback on it. But to test your theory a little bit, now we know that there were some other events where people were raised from the dead in the Bible that we don't at least have any record of earthquakes. And you may have alluded this a little bit earlier, but I just want to make sure this is clear. A couple, for instances, are Elijah. He actually raised someone from the dead, we're told. Lazarus himself. And even Peter raised up someone in the book of Acts. In those particular events, we did not at least hear an earthquake associated. How would you explain that within your model?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's where you have to differentiate between a resurrection that is a raising to life, that is back into the mortal body of the person, where that person comes back to life, but then lives out the rest of his life and dies again. He's not resurrected into this imperishable, incorruptible body we've been talking about.
Oh, so he's not in an immortal body. Yeah, all right.
Yeah, examples would be, like you said, Dr. Future, Elijah raising the son of the widow, and there's several examples in both the Old and New Testament. One that's probably familiar to everyone is Lazarus, who passed away and was dead for up to 4 days, and Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, and he apparently lived out his life and then died again. Mm-hmm. We have several other examples of that where Jesus and Simon Peter raised someone up from the dead, and there were no earthquakes associated with those resurrections. At least we're not told of any. So that would be a difference where the spirit actually returns to that body. God sends the spirit back into that body. It's a miracle, yes, but that's all that really takes place. There's not that transformation, not that glorification of the body. So,
okay, so
that would be the main difference there.
The breath comes back into them, the breath of life.
Exactly.
But that's the extent of it.
That's right. And there's several passages in the Bible that refer to that life's breath, or the spirit that God is responsible for, and it returns to that body in the case of a raising to life. So yeah, there would be no earthquakes associated with those, but interestingly enough, there are a couple two or three actually that where there's an actual resurrection, and the persons were raised into immortal bodies, and in each case there's an earthquake associated with those resurrections.
Mm-hmm. Now, one case that really intrigues me, of course they all do, but one that particularly that you elaborate on that I don't hear other writers talking about when they discuss the gospel narrative, is the fact that when Jesus resurrected from the dead, there was a massive earthquake, and a number of graves opened, and it says that these saints actually came up out of the ground and went into Jerusalem and presented themselves to other people. Now, for something that fantastic, I am so surprised that people do not discuss this further. They just sort of gloss over it, like,
it's like a footnote.
Yeah, so what? So some people raised from the dead and went down in town, move on to the next story.
Right.
Let's get on to the baguettes. But you're one of the few people that says, let's stop, let's figure out what happened here. And I want to talk about that a little bit further. You submit that not only was Jesus one that was transformed by this power and glorified body, but possibly even these people who opened up from the ground as well. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Now that is not an essential statement for your proposal to be true, because even if Jesus alone raised from the dead, it could have caused a strong localized earthquake. So, and we know Jesus was in a glorified body, so that alone would prove it. But you go further and say that it's possible that these other people could be in that state as well too. Correct?
Absolutely, that's correct.
Okay. Now, what do you think happened after they presented themselves? If they were in fact in resurrected bodies, they should be. In glorified bodies, they should be immortal. Do you have any kind of surmising of what they might be even doing now? I don't know if anybody ever even talks about that possibility. What do you think they did after they presented themselves in Jerusalem? What was the aftermath?
White Castle.
Yeah. What's that?
I said White Castle. They went to White Castle.
Yeah, really.
Well, there's the next best thing to heaven. If you ask me. I don't know if you're in White Castle country there in
we
Kansas.
are definitely not in White Castle country.
Well, I'm
lucky you.
I'm sure sorry to hear that. When you come to see the Future Quake staff, we'll treat you right.
I have had them once when I was in Chicago, I believe, but
it's like it's like having your own glorified body. That's fine.
I don't know about that.
Back to the question, Tom. Well, what do you think? What's your hypothesis on what happened in the aftermath of this?
Well, the listeners might not know exactly what we're talking about, so
that's a frequent occurrence on the Future Quake show, David.
Sometimes we don't.
Yes.
Yeah, well, let's just read the passage and see what it says. A lot of people who consider themselves Christians don't even know that this passage exists in the Bible, and so it's kind of a shock to them when they hear it the first time. But Matthew 27:50 through 54. Then Jesus cried out with a loud voice and gave up his spirit. Just then the temple curtain was torn in two from top to bottom. Period. The earth shook and the rocks were split apart, and tombs were opened, and the bodies of many saints who had died were raised. They came out of the tombs after his resurrection and went into the holy city, meaning Jerusalem, and appeared to many people. Now when the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and what took place, they were extremely terrified and said, "Truly, this one was God's son." Now when you compare this passage to the other gospel narratives of Jesus' death and resurrection, you will not find any mention of these many saints that were raised. Only Matthew refers to this. And so it's interesting in Luke, there's very, very similar wording to what is in Matthew, except the whole kind of parenthetical about these many saints is left out, where it says just after the temple was torn from top to bottom, that begins the section where Matthew talks about a shaking of the earth, tombs coming open, and bodies being raised from the dead, coming out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection. And then Luke picks up with, now when the centurion saw those things. So this entire section is like a parenthetical, by the way, kind of a state paragraph by Matthew. So what's going on here? Well, what I believe is taking place here is when Jesus was raised from the dead, there was so much power and so much energy that was being displaced in our three-dimensional world in that tomb that it caused a localized shaking, like you said, of his tomb and the surrounding tombs, perhaps, of many saints who had also been buried. And what we have is tombs coming open. Well, how did the tombs come open? They had to have come open with the shaking of the earth, right?
Sure.
I mean, tombs don't come open unless, there's some shaking going on.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe these are the kind of tombs that were in the holes in the earth and in the caves and things like that back in that time. And it says that they came out of their tombs after his resurrection. So if we have tombs coming open with the shaking of the earth, and they came out of their tombs at the resurrection, what I believe had to have taken place was these people were raised and came out of their tombs upon the shaking of the earth at Jesus' resurrection, not what it sounds like, the shaking of the earth at his death. And that's kind of what it sounds like when you first read it, that, okay, there was an earthquake when Jesus died,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've seen Passion, where the Roman soldiers are running around scurrying and trying to thrust a sword in Jesus' side because the earth is shaking and there's rumbling all around. Well, I don't believe that was the case at all, because an eyewitness to that whole sequence was John. And in his gospel, he did not mention any shaking or any earthquake going on when Jesus died. What I believe happened was this earthquake took place at his resurrection. And right after his resurrection, these many saints also were raised and came out of their tombs. Unless they, were kind of sitting there for 3 days. The tombs came open and the earth shook, and they were just sitting there in their graves for 3 days, and then, now we can come out of our tombs and raise from the dead because Jesus is finally raised. No, I don't think that's what happened at all.
Mm-hmm.
The Bible says that Jesus was the first fruits of the resurrection of the dead.
Right.
And so he had to be raised first, and then the gospel writer Matthew makes it clear that after his resurrection they came out of their tombs.
Now that's if in fact their bodies were glorified bodies. If they were glorified bodies, they would need to be at least coincident when Jesus rose or shortly thereafter. If they were if they were not glorified bodies, which again would not do anything to your theory about the earthquake association, then that would not be necessary. But if it is so, now one thing sort of interesting, if in fact that was true, that the earthquake and their raising was at the time when Jesus was raised, there are other passages in Scripture that suggest that he came amongst the Old Testament saints and led them out of the Abraham's bosom or wherever they might be. That would be an interesting time for their spirits to re-inhabit glorified bodies at the time that those tombs open up.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a good possibility as well.
But it still leaves the bigger question is, what did those people do when they, was it just a sampling of the people who were in the earth? Was it just something to show further proof of the power of God? And if so, if they were in glorified bodies, what are they up to now?
Right. What is the whole purpose of God raising these people? If it's just a parenthetical, is there any other reason for it? And another thing is your initial question was, how do we know that they were in immortal bodies? And really, there's no record of there being a mass killing of, a large number of people in that area that would necessitate the phrase many saints to be used of their resurrection. We know that Jesus was crucified on Passover and 2 thieves with him, but there's no record in the historical record of a large number of people passing away such that their bodies would be able to be non-decomposed and resurrected back into their mortal bodies. So what I'm saying here is that I believe that they had to be resurrected back into immortal bodies, because we don't really have a record of there being a large number of people that could be considered many saints who had just recently died and could be resurrected back into their mortal bodies.
So you're saying because their bodies would have wasted away and decayed, there had to have been some major transformation done to them?
Absolutely.